Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am back as promised with my head-to-head comparison with the 50mm f1.4, released 2024, and then the 50mm f1.8 S, which was released, I believe, in 2018. Now, Nikon's marketing strategy with this common prime focal length is, I think, what you would call a little bit odd. I think initially it probably made more sense in that they had the idea that rather than going with more expensive f1.4 premium primes, that they would go for a more affordable design in an f1.8 lens. However, unlike most f1.8 lenses, they decided to make them a premium option. And then of course there was a nice market separation when they added in the 50mm f1.2 lenses, which are much bigger and heavier and costs, several times as much. Everything made sense until they much later decided to release a series of 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm f1.4 primes. But where the paradigm shifts is that these are more like the entry-level primes, not really entry-level in terms of build. The 50mm f1.4 is nearly the same size as the 50mm f1.8 S. It's fairly close in cost, about $130 left, and confusingly, it has at least one key feature that the premium lens lacks. So, is the slower 50mm f1.8 still the niftiest 50 from Nikon? Well, let's find out. Now, before we jump in, to give you a disclosure on these, the 50mm f1.4 is a lens that I purchased from retail last year myself. Got it from Camera Canada, which I often go to buy my own gear. 50mm f1.8 S is a loaner from Nikon Canada. However, they had no input on this video, nor did they see it in advance. And so they have no input on my conclusions, which are my own. So let's start our comparison by talking about, well, what is similar. These are extremely similar in size. They have the same diameter. The f1.8 lens is 2.5 millimeters shorter and it's 7 grams less. In other words, it's so close that you're not going to really notice the difference. Both of them have 6.2 millimeter front filter threads. Both of them, as I break down the weather sealing diagram, seem to have a similar amount of seals, around 7, and to have them in similar places. Both of them have 9 rounded aperture blades that seem to behave pretty similarly in terms of keeping in a circular shape as it's stopped down. Both of them are capable of doing aperture racks and doing them at about the same level, as you can see here. They both exhibit similar levels of focus breathing, which is to say very, very little, and that is helped by the fact that there is a focus breathing compensation available in my Nikon Z8 body. Both of them have STM focus motors, and they both seem to have pretty similar amount of speed. And you can see here in my test that it takes them about the same amount of time to rack from close to a distant subject and back and forth, whether indoors or outdoors. I didn't shoot them at the same time shooting the same sports. However, I shot with the 50mm f1.4. I shot some basketball action. I didn't have any issues with keeping focus as moved along even in quick burst. And then I shot squash action with the 50mm f1.8 S. And again, I had no problems there. Both of them seem to deliver pretty similar results in my hand test during video testing as I transitioned from my hand to my eye and back and forth. And so they achieved about similar performance in that area. Both of them have almost no distortion. And so that isn't really a factor between the two of them because in either case, you could get by without doing any kind of distortion correction at all. So there's actually a surprising amount of similarities between these two lenses, which, kind of makes sense when you consider the fact that the price is also fairly similar. However, we'll look at some reasons to choose one or the other, starting with the 50mm f1.4, the newer lens. Well, obviously, the first factor to consider is that it does have a brighter maximum aperture. F1.4 is 2/3 stop brighter than f1.8, meaning that this lens has about 1.66 times more light gathering potential than the 50mm f1.8. So that is going to have some factors where it plays into your photography. Another key issue, I noted a feature that's present here that was missing on the S-line lens, and that is a separate customizable control ring. That's a big deal because it means that the manual focus ring can always be the manual focus ring, whereas the customizable control ring can do whatever other function you want. On the F1.8 S, you have to choose between one or the other in the function, and so that means that it's just going to be more limiting on a practical level. I also found that you can focus about 3 centimeters closer with the f1.4 lens, and it is rated at a higher 0.17 times magnification versus the 0.15 times of the f1.8 S. Now, that larger maximum aperture means that everything else being equal, you can produce a more blurred out background with larger, softer specular highlights. And in a secondary area where you can get more blurred out backgrounds, obviously you can focus a little bit closer as well, and that also contributes to having a more blurred out background. You also are going to get rounder specular highlights or bokeh balls across the frame. And so it's a little bit better as it reaches into the corners and is able to achieve rounder results there relative to the 50mm f1.8. So some good reasons to choose the 50mm f1.4. And then of course, in addition to that is the fact that it is about $130 cheaper. And so price is going to be another compelling factor to consider it. But there are some equally valid reasons to choose the 50mm f1.8. First of all, if you take a look at the MTF charts, you can see that its performance is much, much better. This is the much sharper lens, and in reality, it's night and day. It is much sharper all across the frame, and in a secondary factor, it has much higher contrast. The 50mm f1.4 has a little bit more of a classic rendering to it, to where it's not super sharp or high contrast wide open, and then it sharpens up and contrast increases as you stop the lens down. The 50mm f1.8 S has so much contrast and micro contrast that it almost feels like an apochromatic lens to me. I was very pleasantly surprised by how amazing the contrast was and its ability to delineate fine details and fine textures as a byproduct. This also has much lower fringing. And whereas the 50mm f1.4 does struggle with particularly longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, the S lens does not at all. It's really well controlled for that. It does have a little bit less vignette. Now, both of these are higher than what I would hope, but this has required a plus 71 to correct for, whereas the f1.4 lens required a plus 88. Not necessarily a radical difference, but it's enough to be a factor. This also, surprisingly, even though it's at a disadvantage in terms of depth of field, I did find that Nikon's engineers were more kind of thorough in developing the performance of the lens near the edges of the frame. And so I found that whereas the rendering gets a little bit nervous, maybe as we'll call it on the f1.4, the f1.8 remains nice and smooth right out into the corners. And so it's a little bit better engineered in that regard. On the autofocus side of things, I did note that autofocus was largely similar, but what I did find when I did back-to-back focus pulls, as you can see here, even though there is still that occasional rack that I see often on Nikon, I found that there was less kind of fluttering around with the f1.8 versus the f1.4, and so it just did a better job of just going back and forth from subject to subject without any kind of micro pulsing, which I did see a bit of on the f1.4 lens. Also, while the f1.4 lens does have a higher level of magnification, the f1.8 S is a much better in terms of its up-close performance. It exhibits a flatter plane of focus, it has better contrast, it renders more fine detail. So while you might get a little bit more in the image from the f1.4, I would prefer the f1.8 lens in doing just a tiny bit of crop to get to the same magnification level of the f1.4, because you're going to get a much stronger end result. Now, while the F1.4 won for having the separate customizable control ring, this has an actual AF/MF switch, which the F1.4 lens lacks. I always like having that switch. Even on like my Z8 body, it does have a dedicated control for that. I still like it better on the lens. It's just a little bit more of a straightforward process. I also noted that while the F1.4 lens can produce larger specular highlights or bokeh balls, this lens does not have any kind of fringing on them. And so while they're bigger on the F1.4, on this lens, they're cleaner looking, and I prefer them overall. Now, if you want a deeper dive into the optics between these two lenses, I do have that comparison that is coming up at the end of the video. But my conclusion is this. I actually really like the 50mm F1.4 in a lot of ways, but when you put them head to head, there really isn't a lot of reasons to choose the F1.4 lens unless A, you really need F1.4, or B, that little bit of a price difference of $130 is a deal breaker, and for some people it will be. But the S-line lens is definitely the premium lens despite having that smaller maximum aperture. It is a much higher performing lens. It has a little bit nicer build quality to it. It just feels a little more upscale, and it certainly performs more upscale relative to the cheaper F1.4 lens. And so I would say it is still the lens to buy despite the confusing aperture values between these two lenses. If you want more information, I do have linked in the description the full text and video reviews for both lenses. And of course, we've got that optical breakdown if you want to see how they compare head to head. Let's dive in, let's take a look. Okay, we'll start off by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that really neither one of these lenses suffers from much of anything. You have a mild amount of pincushion distortion, just like 1 or 2% on the F1.4, a tiny bit of barrel distortion on the F1.8. Both of them correct very linearly, no problem there. A slight bit more vignette on the F1.4 lens, but it's about a 8 or 9% difference, so not huge there. Much more significant is the difference in the fringing, and we'll see that in real world in just a moment, but you can see even on the test chart, there's a lot of longitudinal style chromatic aberration on the F1.4. The F1.8 S is essentially perfect in that regard. Now, if we take a look at sharpness, we'll start by putting them wide open. So I'm keeping the F1.4 on the left for all of these comparisons. So you can see F1.4 versus F1.8. The F1.8 lens is radically sharper and much, much higher contrast. It's just not even close. Here in the mid frame, radical difference there, up into the corner, and you can see that the difference remains everywhere. So what if we make it apples to apples? We'll do F1.8 versus F1.8. You can see that while the contrast is a little bit improved on the F1.4, it's still nowhere near the class of the F1.8 S-line lens. If we jump on to F2.8, you can see that the S-line is just getting sharper, whereas the F1.4 lens, it's definitely not getting sharper the same way. And so we can see that's true just everywhere that we look. They're probably closest in the corners, but even there, the S-line lens is winning. By F4, you can just see that they're just different kinds of lenses. They just don't have the same degree of resolution. The F1.4 lens is really lagging in terms of contrast and detail. F5.6 hasn't really changed. You can see that we're starting to get a little bit of that moire pattern on the F1.4 lens that shows that contrast is increasing, but certainly not to the level of the S-line lens. Now, the F1.4 lens can focus about 3 centimeters closer and has a 0.17 level of magnification versus 0.15. But that's about where the advantage ends. You can see that it doesn't have nearly as flat a plane of focus. You can see that, focus is just on one little area and then it kind of falls off towards the edges, whereas we have a much flatter plane of focus with the F1.8 lens. Furthermore, even if we look where the two lenses are focused, it's just not even close. The F1.4 lens is just not nearly as sharp. It's got some fringing that's impacting it. We move over to this zone and already it's out of the plane of focus, whereas a flatter plane of focus on the F1.8 produces much more even results. Now in this comparison, we'll see a little bit of give and take. First of all, advantage for the f1.4 lens, the bokeh balls or specular highlights, they're bigger, they're rounder, they're probably generally more pleasing. If you look inside here, they're just cleaner, less busyness in terms of activity, a lot more going on in the f1.8. However, the f1.4 is marred by that fringing that shows up there, and of course that fringing shows up here also, and so it does kind of uglify things, and it robs it of some contrast as well, whereas the S-line lens is just really, really well corrected. Now, something interesting here that I don't often see, and that is by f2, we can see that the situation is kind of reversed, where the specular highlights are actually a little bit bigger on the S-line lens. I don't really often see that, so that's unusual for me. You can see that fringing has improved, but definitely still present. You can still see it there, and so it doesn't go away quickly, and it is still there in the outlining of the specular highlights. Both of them are starting to show the shape of the aperture blades a bit, though the general impression is round-ish. We'll go one step further here, and so we can see at f2.8, fringing is leaving, but not yet completely gone. Less of it around the specular highlights, a little bit less pronounced. And again, we see that trend where the S-line lens is actually producing the bigger and not necessarily softer. You can see it's still smoother in the f1.4, but I mean, that's certainly some advantage there. It was this comparison that surprised me a little bit, and so I expected here is where the f1.4 lens was going to get some clear wins. And certainly you can see if you look in this zone here, it is softer and more defocused than what it is on the f1.8 lens. And obviously specular highlights, as we can see here, are a little bit bigger and softer on the f1.4 lens. If we look at the subject here, the focus is not in identical places on here, but I mean, mostly if you look in this zone, you can see that the contrast is not as good on the chain here. I mean, there's definitely some differences, but where I was a little bit surprised is in this zone, transition zone, you can see that the f1.8 lens is actually softer. If we move off towards the edge of the frame, things are starting to get busy in this area. There's a little bit of busyness in this zone, but definitely this area here, much smoother on the f1.8 S-line lens. Likewise on this side, where it gets a little more chaotic, the fringing doesn't help, but you can see it's handled a bit better. And then up in this zone in particular, I felt like this starts to get really nervous looking, whereas it's a lot softer looking and just it's better on the f1.8 lens. And of course, if we stop down to f1.8 on the f1.4 lens, that advantage really just kind of continues to improve. And now it doesn't have the same advantage when it comes to the specular highlights. And so it just means that in general, I think that the bokeh is just not as smooth as what we're seeing on the S-line lens. And frankly, as I said, that did surprise me. Now, I chose this setting because the previous one is a complementary scene. This one is not. This is a difficult scene because there's a lot of like bare branches. And it's here where I think I do prefer the rendering from the f1.4 lens. Whereas here you can see that the darker contrast makes this area look darker and thus grab the eye more. On the f1.4 lens, the lower contrast actually helps to where you see the subject more and you see this area here less. And so as you transition towards defocus, I think it works better on the f1.4 lens. If we look in this zone, I think that there's not a lot of difference, but again, the lower contrast does help in that area, just draws the eye a little bit less. One final comparison, stop down to f2.8. You can see that even here, the contrast being lower means that, all things being equal, my eye is still less drawn to this than what it is on the f1.8 lens. Now, if you look at the subject, you can see that, it's kind of night and day in terms of the contrast and detail there. But again, in areas like this here, I think that the f1.4 lens wins in that kind of situation. So it does have some advantages, but most of the optical advantages go to the S-line lens. And so as you can see, in most of these contests, the S-line lens definitely wins in a pretty compelling way. There's a little bit of a win here and there for the 50mm f1.4, but I think at the end of the day, this is the high performer optically, and it shows. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.